A heavy, sulfur-laden mist crept into the valley at dawn, seeping through every crack in the stone walls and pooling in the sunless hollows between the abandoned cottages. What had once been a vibrant ribbon of farmland, where orchards blushed pink with spring blossoms and children chased butterflies among the wheat, now lay silent under a sickly haze. The air tasted of bleach and iron, each breath felt like swallowing shards of glass, and every living thing bent beneath the weight of invisible poison. Tree limbs, once supple with green leaves, drooped like spent sails. The river, its current still, lay clothed in a film of oily sheen, and the few villagers left huddled in doorways, coughing into ragged scarves as they watched their world wither around them. Down in the heart of that blighted expanse, the old church tower stood half buried in yellow fog, its bell silent, its steeple crowned in rust. Word had spread that help was near, messages scrawled on tatters of cloth tied to driftwood and set adrift on the molasses-thick river, but the currents ran slow and erratic, dissolving pleas before they could reach rescue parties. Lanterns swung unlit in the square, for oil was scarce and matches too valuable to waste. A child's draft-blown drawing of a red cross lay plastered to a dying barn door, thumb-nailed in place by a father's trembling hand, but wind and rain had already washed the color from the paper, leaving only pale smudges in the gloom. High above all this despair, Cedric the Crow sat atop a jagged outcrop of limestone, head cocked as he studied the valley's unfolding tragedy. His black feathers gleamed like polished obsidian in the meager light, and his eyes, sharp as chipped flint, took in every detail. The pattern of scorched earth radiating from the old chemical works at the valley's head, the stench of decay that rolled downhill in ragged plumes, the jitter of insects that dared to survive in the poison damp. He had flown these skies for seasons and had never seen such a deep, sorrowful hush, as if the land itself held its breath in mourning. With a single, decisive caw that rang like an alarm bell in the still air, Cedric launched himself into the murk, wings slicing through the toxic fog. He carried no human promise, no engineer's blueprint for filtration or doctor's vial of antidote, only his own fearless spirit and the strange ability birds sometimes possess to bridge worlds. As he wheeled above the crumbling rooftops, he began to formulate a plan born of instinct and the urgent cry of a valley on the brink. For in a place where every human voice had been swallowed by poison, it would be the silent flight of a lone crow that would carry the first true message of hope. Daylight struggled to pierce the noxious veil that blanketed the valley, transforming the air into a living wall of yellowing haze. Beneath that choking canopy, the villagers moved like phantoms, their forms blurred by the poisoned mist as they scrambled to fashion a signal that might cut through the foul air. In the narrow lane outside the old apothecary, the blacksmith's daughter, Milena, knelt by a mud-slicked channel, tying a scrap of crimson cloth to a length of driftwood. The river, thick with runoff from the abandoned chemical works upstream, carried the bundle grudgingly, its murky currents swallowing color and hope alike. Milena watched it bob into the haze, her heart pounding, but before the cloth could crest the bend, it disappeared like a ghost into the yellow gloom. Across the square, the schoolteacher, Tomas, poured the last of his oil into a battered lamp and tried to kindle a flame beneath the church's collapsed spire. Each match he struck hissed and died before the glass could glow, the oil reeked of sulfur from contamination, and the wick crumbled in his shaking fingers. Frustrated, he lashed the lamp with a length of rope to the steeple's empty belframe, imagining that any flicker of light might be spotted by rescue parties. But when the wind thrust the mist into the ruin, even that candleless lamp became invisible, a dark silhouette swallowed by the greater darkness of poisoned air. Every attempt at communication ended the same, hopeful signals muted by the valley's toxic breath. Shouts of help died in mid-word, coughing gasps following the effort to scream. Drifts of ash floated from nowhere, settling like gray snow on the villagers' shoulders. Even the dogged tinker's efforts to mount a makeshift semaphore, a pair of old wagon wheels rigged to spin in the breeze, failed to generate motion, the gears corroded shut by acid mist. Each failure deepened the valley's sense of abandonment, a collective despair so dense it pressed like stone against every heart. High above the stricken town, perched on a jagged limestone crag, Cedric the Crow bore silent witness to each thwarted plea. He had seen Milena's red cloth vanish beneath the yellow wave, and watched Tomas's lamp stand dark against the steeple. He had heard the clatter of the blacksmith's hammer fall silent when he tried to ring the bell, and the soft sob of the tinker when his gears refused to budge. From his vantage, Cedric could perceive the valley's broken patterns, currents diverting driftwood off course, acid droplets corroding oil, static air preventing sound from carrying. He understood that these human messages were being swallowed before they could ever reach the world beyond the haze. Driven by an instinct older than any plumbing or lamp, Cedric dropped from his crag without a sound and alighted in the schoolyard, just beside the sealed well. Milena, kneeling in the dust, looked up in startled awe as the crow hopped toward her, eyes gleaming like polished onyx. She hesitated, then spoke in a breathless whisper, Can you carry this?" She held out the last bright remnant, a strip of red cloth, now damp and heavy. Cedric pecked at the cloth gently, then took it in his beak and backed away, flapping his wings in a slow windmill. Even through the poisoned haze, she perceived the resolve in his movements, that he would carry her silent plea farther than any driftwood, brighter than any flaring lamp. As he ascended into the yellow soup, Cedric felt the valley's silent relief ripple beneath him. Though the air would still taste of bleach and iron, and the fog cling like a living shroud, he now bore in his beak the first true message of hope, the villager's final, unbroken whisper, "We survive, help us." And in that moment, the poisoned valley found its voice once more, carried on the wings of a lone crow determined to break the silence high above the poisoned valley. Cedric the crow rode the thermals with effortless grace, his glossy black wings slicing through the thick yellow haze like blades of midnight. From his lofty perch in the cerulean sky, he surveyed the sprawling fields and sodden orchards that once brimmed with life but now lay marred by the silent corrosion of chemical runoff. Plumes of acrid steam rose from the old smelter ruins at the valley's head, curling into the low-hanging fog and poisoning every breath that drifted downwind. Cedric's sharp eyes, twin beads of onyx glinting beneath the sun, traced the sickly patterns in the vegetation below, rows of withered apple trees whose bark wept yellow resin, fields where wheat stalks curled upon themselves like scorched ribbons, and the river itself, blackened where it cut through rusted earth before fading into the haze. He circled once, twice, mapping the boundaries between the most lethal blight zones and those strips of land where scarlet poppies still clung to life, their petals bright beacons against the sallow backdrop. By angling his wings, he felt each eddy of wind shift around him, learned how currents carried the worst of the toxic vapors, and found the safer channels where the air thinned and life might hold on. Farther down, he spied clusters of abandoned oil drums half submerged in flooded terraces, rusting barrels that had leaked their stubborn poisons into the groundwater. Cedric banked sharply, his tail feathers fanning wide to maintain control, and then dipped low, wings folded in a controlled dive toward a lone farmhouse whose tiled roof was the only roof in the valley that still gleamed white. He landed atop the weather vane, surveying a scene of stubborn survival, the farmhouse's small vegetable patch, ringed by a stone wall, sheltered by a plume of steam rising from a wood-fired stove. Smoke spiraled upward, cutting a clean channel through the yellow fog, and Cedric knew that inside, a handful of survivors still tended a garden of hardy greens, perhaps dandelion leaves, perhaps the bitter celery that thrived in alkaline soil. With a respectful caw, he hopped to the weather vane's arrow and peered through the fissured window where, beneath the shutters, he glimpsed the flicker of candlelight and the outline of a figure stirring a steaming pot. Below him, in the stale courtyard, lay an overturned wheelbarrow full of scraps, tattered cloth banners, broken signal lamps, and desperate messages scrawled on splintered wood. Cedric's gaze shifted upward again, and he recognized that none of these tokens of distress would reach the outside world. Each attempt at human signaling had been eaten by the valley's lethal breath, smoke smothered before it could rise, cloth shredded by acid droplets, and sound sucked empty by the dense fog. But now, perched where air was still tolerable, he began to weave a new plan in his crow's mind. He would gather each fragment, driftwood, cloth, lamp parts, and carry them beyond the worst of the contamination. Up there, where his wings could cleave a path above the blight, he could reassemble their pleas into a message that no human-made instrument had been able to deliver. With a flick of his beak, he snagged a torn scrap of crimson cloth from the weather vane's rusted finial. Next, he plucked a length of frayed rope from the rafters, where survivors had hung it in futile semaphore. And then he scooped down to seize the battered signal lamp, its glass pane cracked but its metal casing still polished bright. With his prize items balanced in his beak and talons, Cedric launched himself into the sky, wings beating until the valley fell away beneath him. As the poisoned fog receded in his wake, he left behind a single, resolute caw, a vow that these shattered human messages would not be swallowed by the blight but would take wing on his fearless flight, carried beyond the contaminated hills to deliver a final, unbroken plea for hope under the jaundiced sky. Cedric spiraled over the crumbling walls of the old apothecary, its once proud spire now half collapsed and slick with acid rain. Below, the courtyard lay littered with broken barrels and empty mortar shells where the village healer had stored her precious stock of antidote vials, tiny glass vials filled with a deep amber serum said to neutralize the valley's poison. Guards, clad in oil-stained leathers and gas masks, patrolled between rusted benches, their rifles propped against the mossy walls. Cedric watched their shifting postures, the way they guarded the west gate more heavily than the east, and he knew this must be where the cure was kept in secret. Drifting with the thermals, he swooped down to a gnarled ash beam that jutted from the apothecary's roof, folding his wings against his sides to land silently. Each step he took sent tremors through the brittle wood beneath his talons, but he balanced with unerring quiet. Below him, a guard shifted his rifle, pointing its barrel toward the broken south door as though expecting an intruder from the ruined fields. Cedric froze, black eyes narrowing. Then, with a feather-light hop, he traversed the beam toward the shattered window where the cured vials glimmered on a high ledge. Inside, shards of moonlight illuminated the dust-choked shelves, and Cedric's sharp ears caught the tinkle of glass as he nudged loose a brittle crate with a single peck. The crate spilled its contents, half a dozen vials nestled in straw, each labeled with the healer's careful script. The serum scent, bitter against his beak, mixed with the lingering odor of camphor and old herbs. He seized the nearest vial in his beak, clutched another between talons, and backed away toward the window's fractured shutter. A sudden cough from below, one of the guards patrolling the courtyard, sent his heart hammering like twin drumbeats. He crouched low, blending his outline with the broken plaster, wings spread in a silent fan of shadow until the guard moved on, oblivious to the theft above. Once the sounds of patrol receded, Cedric vaulted from the window, tucking the vials securely beneath his powerful chest feathers. His wings beat a swift tattoo against the rancid air as he banked away from the decaying structure, rising above the valley's poisoned airs. Below him, the yellow fog swirled like living water, but he climbed higher, into a ribbon of cleaner wind that whisked him above the worst of the blight. Each powerful stroke steered him toward the village's center, where Milena and the villagers waited in their sheltered haven by the elder elm. As he soared, he imagined the grateful murmur of the sick as the serum coursed through their veins, undoing the curse that had strangled life from their fields and lungs. By the time Cedric's silhouette darkened the sky above the clearing, the first flames of lanterns had flickered alive among the trees. He spiraled down in a final arc, offering a triumphant caw that echoed against the valley's dismal hush. In the gathering light, the villagers rushed to meet him, their outstretched hands trembling as they removed the vials from his wings. Milena pressed her cheek against his gleaming plumage, tears streaking through her soot-stained face, and the healer unclasped her sack to prepare the first dose. As Cedric watched from his low perch, the serum's amber glow seemed almost to push back the yellow haze, a beacon of hope reborn on the crow's daring flight. And in that quiet dawn, he knew that the stolen cure would mend not just bodies, but the very soul of the valley he called home. The poisoned wind howled like a chorus of accusing spirits as Cedric lifted off from the healer's elm, two precious vials secured beneath his broad chest feathers. Each beat of his ebony wings drove him into the storm's heart, where swirling mists of sulfurous acid hissed against the stone walls of the valley. He angled low, skimming the jagged rooftops of ruined cottages, so the heavier bursts of fallout splashed harmlessly behind him, but even this tactic could not spare his plumage from the acid's burn. Tiny pockmarks appeared on feathers that had once shone like polished jet, and a spatter of yellow droplets steamed where they touched. He climbed swiftly above the rooftops, seeking the narrow ribbon of cleaner air that wound like a silver thread along the valley's eastern spine. Below him, twisted orchards lay choked by the haze, branches felled by the chemical downpour. The river that had once fed these fields now churned a toxic brew, its surface slick with iridescent sheen. Cedric banked hard to avoid a plume of acrid steam rising from the old smelter's chimney, its bellows of poison threatening to engulf him in a suffocating cloud. With a fierce caw of defiance, he angled toward an unseen updraft rising from the rocky cliffs, feeling each swirl of air lift him out of the worst of the contamination. High above, the wind finally eased into a brittle whisper, and Cedric realized he had breached the valley's poisoned throat. There, the sky shone with brittle clarity, and he could glimpse the distant ridge where the clean air waited. He folded his wings briefly, diving like an arrow toward that promise, then recovered with a strong thrust and set his course northward, toward the mountain pass that led back to the world beyond the blight. Every muscle in his body trembled with the exertion, feathers clinging wetly to his form, but he dared not slow. In his mind's eye he saw the healer's grateful smile and the faces of the villagers, paling and withering under the toxic siege, now strengthened by the stolen antidote. The acid wind bit at his throat as he rose above the crest of the pass, but there, in a narrow canyon of stone, he found a pocket of pure air, proof that life could endure even the harshest scourge. He paused on a jagged outcrop, talons gripping the rock, and gave a single, triumphant caw that echoed through the cleansing heights. Then, with vials still intact and spirit unbroken, Cedric launched himself into the final stretch of sky, braving the last mile to deliver hope where it was needed most. The wail of the sulphurous gale had barely subsided when Cedric spotted movement at the valley's far rim, dark shapes slipping between scorched oak stumps and ruined wagons, moving with the furtive grace of scavengers unleashed by desperation. His heart thudded like a drum in his chest as he realized these were no mere crows, these were men and women broken by the poison, driven mad by hunger and fear into looting whatever scraps remained of the valley's shattered stores. Between them and the pass lay the last stretch of untainted air, and in his beak he still carried the 2 vials of curing serum that could turn this land's sorrow into salvation. To lose them now would doom every soul still clinging to life below. With a sharp caw that cut through the twilight haze, Cedric banked low, talons extended, and swept down upon the nearest scavenger. The startled figure dropped a rotting sack of grain and lifted a gnarled staff in a futile warding gesture as the crow's ebony wings whistled past. Using a deft twist of his body, Cedric alighted on the man's shoulder, beak probing at the folds of his threadbare coat until he found a stolen crate of preserved seed. With a swift, decisive tug, he yanked the crate free, sending it tumbling into the dust. The scavenger cursed, clutching at his back as if hoping to anchor themselves against the raid, but Cedric was already airborne again, vaulting over broken barrels and heat-blistered stones. Behind him, the other scavengers scrambled into action, brandishing rusted cutlasses and pitted spears that glinted with malice in the dying light. Cedric dipped low, darting between outstretched metal, letting the weapons slash harmlessly past feathers already mottled by acid and ash. Each wave of scavengers was an assault on his resolve, but he remembered the villagers' ailing children, the trembling hands of the healer clutching her empty kit. With a fierce twist, he flapped upward, using the momentum to bear the vials higher, lifting them beyond the reach of marauding arms. A spear hissed past his flank, missing by inches, and rattled against a blackened boulder with a clang that echoed like a death knell, but Cedric did not slow. As night fell, the fog thickened into a living shroud, and the scavengers' cries became lost in the gloom. Yet Cedric did not falter, trusting his instincts more than his failing eyesight. He followed the subtle change in wind, the cleaner breaths that whispered of the pass ahead, and fought to keep the vials nestled securely against his feathers. Twice a scavenger lunged from the gloom, clutching at his legs with desperate hands, but each time Cedric shook free, talons digging into deadwood until his pursuer tumbled, cursing into the darkness. Finally, the silhouettes of the mountain's shoulder rose against the starless sky, a pale ridge of unsullied stone marking the gateway to pure air. Cedric pushed upward in one last, mighty surge, passing above the scavengers' reach as they flailed impotently below. When at last he cleared the valley's blasted lip, the fog fell away like a curtain, revealing the vast expanse of moonlit rock and the innocent promise of dawn beyond. With the scavengers swallowed by their own desperation, Cedric cradled the vials to his chest and angled toward the mountain pass, every beat of his weary wings carrying the valley's last hope back to the world of light and life. When the first pale light of dawn crested the western ridge, Cedric found himself soaring above a landscape transformed. The worst of the poisoned fog lay far behind, replaced by the clear, bracing air of the open uplands. Below him, the valley floor still simmered with the last wisps of golden haze, but at its heart lay the small walled garden where the villagers had built their final stand. Cedric banked in a wide circle and descended toward the scattering of villagers already gathered beneath the ancient elm, their faces haggard with weeks of fear but bright with the stubborn fire of hope. As he drifted down, the hush that fell over them was so complete that even the distant caw of him alighting on the lowest branch seemed to echo like a benediction. With supreme care, Cedric tilted his head and offered the first vial to Milena, her hands trembling as she unwrapped the healer's careful binding of silk and leaf. The amber serum caught the rising sun in a sudden flare of gold, and as Milena carried it to the waiting trough beside the well, every child in the courtyard pressed forward, pale cheeks flushed with excitement. The healer, her robe stained with soot and sorrow, drew a trembling breath before uncorking the vial. The liquid's faint citrus scent slipped across the morning air, a crisp promise of renewal where only acrid bitterness had reigned. She poured the cure into the communal water supply, stirring gently as wells bubbled with the first real sign of life in weeks. One by one, villagers stepped forward to sip from tin cups, their eyes brightening as warmth spread from chest to fingertips. Roots yellowed by acid bloom once more with green, wound through the thirsty earth, and as the serum coursed through their veins, each villager felt the choking ache in their lungs begin to loosen. Children laughed for the first time, voices ringing against the leaning walls of ruined cottages, while elders knelt in gratitude beneath the elm's broad branches. Cedric watched from his perch as the trickle of clean water ran through the trough, carving fresh channels in the dusty courtyard, a miniature river of hope that would soon flood the valley's every hollow. By midday, the poison haze had lifted almost entirely, drifting back toward the smelter ruins like a scattering of spent ash. Farms that had lain fallow now showed faint shoots of wheat, and the river, once a black ribbon of death, ran clear with sparkling flow. Cedric, feathers still flecked with the valley's final acid rain, folded his wings and took flight once more, circling above the elm in a silent salute. With every beat of his wings, he carried the valley's gratitude and the promise that no messenger need fear delivering hope, for in the darkest hour a single, determined crow could shatter any silence and lead the world back to life.